My sister has severe autism, and I have carried resentment toward her that has shaped my entire existence in ways I never imagined possible when I was just a child, dreaming of what it meant to be a big sister. There are some truths that feel too heavy to speak aloud, and this is one of them, but sometimes the weight of silence becomes more unbearable than the shame of honesty. I was 8 years old when my sister Emma was born, and I remember the excitement that filled our little house in suburban Denver, Colorado, like sunshine streaming through windows that had been closed for too long. My parents, Mark and Linda, had painted the nursery a soft yellow because they wanted to be surprised, and I had spent months practicing how to hold a baby and thinking about all the games we would play together when she got older. The anticipation felt like Christmas morning stretched into months, and I would fall asleep each night, imagining myself teaching her how to tie her shoes and helping her with homework, and being the kind of big sister that made other kids wish they had what we had. But life has a way of rewriting our stories when we are not looking, and the shift that came after Emma arrived was so gradual at first that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. My parents, who had always made me feel like the center of their universe, suddenly seemed to be looking through me rather than at me, and conversations that used to flow easily around our dinner table became punctuated by long silences, broken only by the sounds of my sister making noises that I did not yet understand were her way of communicating with a world that felt too loud and too bright and too overwhelming for her developing mind. The first real sign that my life was changing came when I was 10, and my parents told me I needed to move from my bedroom on the second floor down to the basement because Emma needed to be closer to them during the night. They explained it gently and with smiles that seemed a little too practiced, but the message was clear enough that even a 10-year-old could understand where the priorities lay in our household now. Moving to the basement felt like being exiled to another country where the language was loneliness, and the currency was the sound of my family living their real lives somewhere above my head, while I learned to navigate the cold concrete floors and the musty smell that seemed to seep into everything I owned. The basement was not just physically colder than my old room, but it carried an emotional chill that settled into my bones and made me feel like I was somehow outside looking in at the family I used to belong to without question. Night after night, I would lie awake listening to the sounds of footsteps above me and wonder what conversations I was missing and what moments of connection were happening in the spaces I was no longer welcome to occupy without invitation. The move was supposed to be temporary, they said, but temporary has a way of becoming permanent when nobody bothers to reevaluate whether the arrangement still serves everyone involved or just some people involved. My relationship with Emma during those early years was complicated in ways that I lacked the emotional vocabulary to express because loving someone and feeling resentful toward them can coexist in the same heart, like two different songs playing simultaneously and creating a harmony that is both beautiful and discordant. She was not just my sister, but also the reason that my childhood began to feel like something I was watching happen to someone else, rather than something I was actively participating in and experiencing. When Emma had meltdowns, which happened frequently and without warning, that I could detect our entire household would reorganize itself around her needs and her timeline and her emotional state, while I learned to make myself smaller and quieter and more invisible so that I did not add any additional stress to an already overwhelming situation for everyone involved. The toys that had been mine before Emma arrived gradually became communal property in a way that nobody explicitly announced, but everyone seemed to understand except for me initially. I would come home from school to find my favorite doll missing an arm or my carefully organized art supplies scattered across the living room floor in ways that suggested they had been used as tools for some kind of sensory exploration that I was not invited to understand or participate in. When I tried to express frustration about these losses, my parents would look at me with expressions that seemed to say I was being selfish and unreasonable for caring about material possessions when my sister was struggling with challenges that were so much bigger than broken toys and missing art supplies. They would remind me that I was the older sister, and that meant I needed to be more understanding and more patient and more willing to sacrifice my wants and needs for the greater good of family harmony. The incident with my laptop happened when I was 15 and represents one of those moments in life where you can feel something fundamental shifting inside you, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves beneath the surface of what appears to be solid ground. My high school had loaned me a MacBook for the semester as part of a program for students who were performing well academically, and I treasured that computer more than almost anything else I owned because it represented recognition of my hard work and my potential in a way that felt increasingly rare at home. I was careful with it in the way that teenagers are careful with things that matter deeply to them, and I always kept it in my backpack in my room where I assumed it would be safe from the chaos that sometimes erupted in the common areas of our house when Emma was having a difficult day. But one afternoon I came home to find the laptop destroyed in a way that suggested it had been thrown or dropped from a significant height, and the screen was shattered, and the keyboard was missing several keys, and there was some kind of liquid damage that made the whole thing appear beyond any hope of repair. My parents were upset, but not with Emma, who had clearly been the one responsible for the destruction, but with me for having left something so important where my sister could access it and damage it. The school was not understanding about the situation, and they asked me to pay for the replacement, which my parents agreed to do, but only after a series of conversations that made it clear they felt I was the one who had been irresponsible and careless rather than Emma, who had simply been acting according to her neurological wiring in a way that was beyond her conscious control. That night, I cried harder than I had cried in years, but not just about the laptop, which could eventually be replaced, but about the growing realization that my experience of being in this family was never going to be treated with the same weight and consideration as my sister's experience, even when her actions directly impacted my life and my opportunities and my emotional well-being. The laptop represented more than a computer to me. It was a symbol of my independence and my academic achievement and my connection to a world outside our house, where I was seen as an individual rather than simply as Emma's sister, who needed to be more understanding and more patient, and more willing to adjust her expectations to accommodate everyone else's needs before her own. Living in that house began to feel like being an actor in a play where everyone else had received the script except for me, and I was supposed to improvise my way through scenes that required knowledge I had not been given and emotional responses that felt authentic, even though nothing about the situation felt natural or fair. Every time Emma needed something, which was frequently and often urgently, I was expected to drop whatever I was doing and help in whatever way was required, regardless of whether I had homework to finish or plans with friends, or simply a desire to exist in my own life without constantly being on call for someone else's crisis management. The expectation was never stated explicitly, but it was communicated through 1,000 small interactions and adjustments and compromises that always seemed to flow in the same direction. My social life during high school became something that existed primarily in the theoretical realm, because maintaining friendships requires a level of consistency and availability that I could not provide when my home life operated in a state of permanent unpredictability. I would make plans with friends only to have to cancel at the last minute when Emma had a meltdown or when my parents needed me to stay home and help manage a situation that had spiraled beyond their ability to handle it alone. Eventually, my friends stopped inviting me to things because they learned that I was more likely to disappoint them than to show up. And I began to understand that my social isolation was not an unfortunate side effect of my family situation, but rather an inevitable consequence of a system that had organized itself around one person's needs, while everyone else learned to adapt and accommodate and gradually disappear into the background of their own lives. The movie theater incident happened when I was 17 and still represents one of those turning points in life where you can see clearly how far you have drifted from the person you used to be, and how desperately you want to find your way back to that version of yourself who believed she deserved to take up space in her own story. My friend Jake had been talking about the new Spider-Man movie for weeks, and his enthusiasm was contagious in a way that reminded me what it felt like to get excited about something simple and normal and age-appropriate. We made plans to see the movie on a Saturday afternoon, and I decided that for once I would turn off my phone and allow myself to exist in a space where I was just a teenager watching a movie with a friend, rather than someone perpetually on standby for the next family emergency that would require my immediate attention and emotional labor. The 2 hours I spent in that dark theater watching a story about someone else's struggles and triumphs felt like the first full breath I had taken in months, and I remember thinking that maybe this was what normal felt like, and maybe I could find ways to create more moments like this, where I was allowed to be 17 and interested in movies and capable of laughing at jokes without worrying about whether my laughter was too loud or too carefree, or somehow inappropriate given the serious nature of everything happening at home. But when I turned my phone back on after the movie and saw the flood of missed calls and text messages, I felt like I was being pulled back underwater after having tasted air for just a moment, and the guilt that washed over me was mixed with anger in a way that felt dangerous and unfamiliar. Mother's voice when I called home was sharp with panic and frustration, and she asked where I had been with an urgency that suggested some kind of genuine emergency had occurred while I was gone. But when I rushed home, expecting to find chaos, I instead found my parents angry at me for having been unreachable during what turned out to be a fairly routine meltdown that they had managed to handle without my assistance. The punishment for my disappearance was being grounded for 2 weeks, and the message was clear that my desire for normal teenage experiences was selfish and irresponsible when my family needed me to be available at all times for whatever might arise. That night, I sat in my basement bedroom feeling like I was trapped in a life that had been designed by someone else and wondering whether I would ever be allowed to be anything other than Emma's sister, who sacrificed her own wants and needs for the greater good of family stability. The conversation about college happened a few months later and still haunts me as one of those moments when someone you love reveals something about how they see you that changes everything about how you see yourself and your place in their world. My father and I were sitting at the kitchen table looking through brochures from different universities, and for a brief moment I felt like we were having the kind of conversation that normal families have, where parents ask their children about their dreams and their interests and their hopes for the future without any hidden agenda or unspoken expectations lurking beneath the surface of what appeared to be genuine curiosity about my educational goals. We talked about different majors in campus life and what kinds of experiences I was hoping to have during my college years, and I found myself getting excited about the possibility of leaving Denver and starting fresh, somewhere where nobody knew me as Emma's sister, but simply as Sarah, who was smart and funny and capable of making her own decisions about how to spend her time and energy. Then my father made what he seemed to think was a harmless joke about how I should choose a major that would prepare me for a high-paying career so that I would be financially able to take care of Emma after he and my mother were gone. And something inside me broke, in a way that felt both sudden and inevitable, like a dam that had been holding back years of accumulated pressure finally giving way under the weight of one final expectation that was simply too much to bear. The explosion that followed was not just about that one comment, but about 18 years of feeling like my identity and my future and my value as a person were all tied to my willingness to be Emma's permanent caretaker and support system, regardless of what I might want for my own life or what dreams I might have that did not center around her needs and her challenges and her requirements for ongoing assistance. I heard myself yelling things that I had never said out loud before about how unfair it was that my entire existence had been organized around being helpful and understanding and accommodating, while nobody ever asked what I needed or wanted or hoped for in my own right. The words poured out of me like water through a broken pipe, and I could not stop them, even though I could see the shock and hurt on my parents' faces as they realized, perhaps for the first time, how much resentment had been building inside me while they thought I was simply being a good sister and a responsible family member. But instead of the apology or the acknowledgement or the conversation about how to make things more fair going forward, that I was hoping for, my parents just stood there looking at me like I had revealed something ugly and disappointing about my character rather than something legitimate about my experience of being their daughter. There was no comfort offered and no validation provided and no indication that they were willing to consider that maybe their approach to parenting had created some unintended consequences that deserved attention and adjustment. Instead, I was left feeling like I had exposed myself as selfish and ungrateful for having feelings and needs that conflicted with what was expected of me as Emma's sister and as a member of this family that had organized itself around one person's requirements, while everyone else learned to disappear into supportive roles that offered no room for individual identity or personal growth. The hours that followed that conversation were some of the loneliest of my life because I stayed in my room waiting for someone to come check on me, or to want to talk about what had happened, or to show some sign that my emotional breakdown mattered enough to warrant attention and follow-up, but nobody came. The silence from upstairs felt like a statement about my importance in this family and my value as a person and my right to have feelings that were inconvenient or difficult or challenging to the status quo that had been established without my input or consent. I realized that night that I had been living in a house where my primary function was to be helpful and where my emotional well-being was secondary to maintaining stability for everyone else, and where expressing dissatisfaction with that arrangement was treated as a character flaw rather than a legitimate complaint about an unsustainable situation. The decision to leave came after another day and night passed without anyone bothering to acknowledge what had happened or to express any interest in understanding why I was so upset about expectations that they apparently felt were reasonable and natural and appropriate. I thought about my grandfather Robert, who lived across town, and who had always seemed to see me as more than just Emma's helper, and who had occasionally expressed concern about how much responsibility I was carrying for someone my age, though he had never interfered directly in how my parents chose to manage their household and their children's roles within it. Without making an elaborate plan, I simply packed some essential items into my backpack and left a note saying I was going to stay with Grandpa for a while because I needed some space to think about things and to figure out who I was supposed to be in this family going forward. The walk to my grandfather's house felt like traveling between two different worlds, and with each step I took away from the house, where I had learned to make myself smaller and quieter and more accommodating, I felt some part of myself that had been compressed and constrained beginning to expand again. Grandpa opened his door before I even knocked, as if he had been waiting for me, and the look in his eyes suggested that he was not entirely surprised to see me standing on his doorstep with a backpack full of clothes and a heart full of confusion about whether I was being selfish or simply trying to survive in a situation that had become impossible to navigate successfully. The week I spent at my grandfather's house was the first time in years that I had experienced what it felt like to live in a space where my presence was welcomed rather than simply tolerated, and where my thoughts and feelings and preferences were treated as legitimate and worthy of consideration, rather than as obstacles to be managed or overcome. We had conversations about college and about what I wanted to study and about what kinds of experiences I was hoping to have as an adult, and not once during those discussions did anyone mention Emma or suggest that my future should be planned around her ongoing needs rather than around my own interests and aspirations. For the first time in years, I felt like I was allowed to be 18 and excited about my own possibilities, rather than constantly worried about how my choices would impact everyone else's stability and comfort. But the peace of that week was interrupted when my parents finally decided to have a conversation with me, though it took them several days to realize that my absence was not just a temporary teenage tantrum, but a serious attempt to establish some boundaries around what I was and was not willing to accept as normal family dynamics. When they came to pick me up, the conversation that followed was not the heart-to-heart discussion about how to make our family work better for everyone, but rather a series of revelations about decisions they had made, without my knowledge and choices they had been making, that directly impacted Emma's care and my role in providing it. My grandfather's reaction to what my parents revealed during that conversation was more intense than I had ever seen him, and his anger was not just about the specific details of how they had been handling Emma's care, but about the broader pattern of dishonesty and manipulation that had been shaping our family dynamics for years without my awareness or understanding. It turned out that Emma was supposed to have been receiving professional care from trained specialists, but that care had never materialized despite the fact that my parents had been telling the extended family that such arrangements were in place and had even been accepting financial help from relatives who thought they were contributing to Emma's professional support system. The discovery that I had essentially been functioning as Emma's unpaid and untrained caregiver, while my parents allowed the rest of the family to believe that appropriate professional help was being provided, felt like the final piece of a puzzle that suddenly revealed a picture I had not been able to see clearly before. The financial support that relatives had been providing was supposed to ensure that Emma received the specialized care she needed, while also ensuring that I could have a normal childhood and adolescence without carrying responsibilities that were inappropriate for someone my age and level of training. Instead, that money had apparently been redirected to other purposes, while I continued to function as the primary source of support for my sister's daily needs and emotional regulation. The extended family's reaction to this revelation was swift and decisive, and for the first time in my life, I felt like there were adults who were willing to advocate for my well-being and my right to have a childhood that was not entirely defined by someone else's needs and challenges. My aunts and uncles who had been sending money to support what they thought was Emma's professional care were furious about being deceived, but they were even more upset about the impact this deception had been having on my development and my opportunities and my sense of self-worth and personal agency. The conversation with my parents the following weekend was supposed to be an opportunity for us to work through these revelations and to find a way forward that would be healthier for everyone involved. But instead, it became clear that they were not interested in acknowledging that their approach had been problematic or in making changes that would allow me to have a more balanced relationship with my sister and my role in her care. When confronted with the evidence of their dishonesty and the impact it had been having on my life, they doubled down on their position that I had essentially been born to be Emma's caretaker, and that questioning this arrangement was selfish and ungrateful rather than reasonable and necessary. The lack of any apology or acknowledgement or willingness to consider that their approach might need adjustment felt like a door closing on any possibility of our family finding a healthier dynamic that would allow me to be both a loving sister and an individual with my own needs and dreams and aspirations. When my father actually said out loud that I had been born to take care of Emma, I realized that they had never seen me as a separate person with my own value and potential, but rather as a resource to be utilized in service of their vision of how our family should function and who should be responsible for what aspects of Emma's ongoing care and support. That night, I made the decision that had been building inside me for months, but that I had been afraid to acknowledge because it felt too big and too permanent and too much like giving up on the family I had always hoped we could become if we could just figure out how to make things work better for everyone involved. But the conversation had made it clear that my parents were not interested in making things work better for everyone, but only in maintaining a system that worked for them and for Emma, while I continued to absorb the costs and the sacrifices and the limitations that such a system required in order to function smoothly. The decision to live with my grandfather permanently and to leave for college in a different state was not one I made lightly because it meant accepting that the family I had grown up in was not going to become the family I needed in order to thrive and develop into the person I was meant to become. But it also represented the first time in my life that I was choosing my own well-being and my own future over the expectations and demands that had been placed on me by others who claimed to love me, but who had never been willing to consider whether their love was being expressed in ways that actually supported my growth and development. My Aunt Patricia, who had been one of the relatives contributing to Emma's supposed professional care, decided that she would redirect that financial support to a college fund for me instead. And for the first time in years, I felt like there were adults in my life who were invested in my success and my happiness rather than just in my usefulness and my willingness to sacrifice my own needs for the sake of family harmony. The calls from my parents after I moved in with Grandpa permanently were not expressions of concern about my well-being or requests to understand why I had felt the need to leave, but rather inquiries about when I planned to return home and resume my previous role in Emma's daily care and support. The complete inability or unwillingness on their part to understand why I had needed to establish some distance from a situation that had become emotionally and psychologically unsustainable for me confirmed that I had made the right decision in choosing to prioritize my own development and my own future, even though it meant disappointing people who had expected me to continue sacrificing my individual identity and aspirations for the sake of family stability. The guilt that I carried about leaving was complicated by a sense of relief that felt almost overwhelming, because for the first time in my life I was living in a space where my presence was valued for who I was, rather than for what I could provide, and where my future was seen as something worth investing in and supporting, rather than something that should be organized around someone else's ongoing needs. The process of applying to colleges in different states felt like planning an escape to a new life where I could discover who I was supposed to become when I was not constantly managing someone else's emotional and physical needs, and where I could develop friendships and interests and goals that were based on my own preferences and abilities rather than on what was required to maintain family stability. The excitement I felt about starting fresh in a place where nobody knew my history or my role as Emma's caretaker was mixed with sadness about the family relationships that had been damaged or lost in the process of advocating for my own well-being and my right to have a life that was not entirely defined by someone else's challenges and requirements. The most difficult part of this entire experience has been coming to terms with the fact that loving someone and needing distance from them can coexist in the same heart without contradiction, and that choosing to prioritize your own mental health and development does not make you a bad person, even when other people interpret your choices as selfish or ungrateful or insufficiently committed to family loyalty. Emma is still my sister, and I still love her deeply, but I have had to accept that my love for her cannot come at the expense of my own identity and my own future and my own right to exist as an individual with my own dreams and aspirations that deserve to be pursued and supported. The revelation that my resentment was never really directed at Emma herself, but rather at a family system that had organized itself around her needs, while neglecting mine, was both liberating and heartbreaking, because it meant that the anger I had been carrying for years was actually grief about the childhood and adolescence I had lost, and the normal developmental experiences I had been denied in service of maintaining stability for everyone else. Emma had no more control over her neurological differences than I had over being born into a family that chose to manage those differences in a way that required one child to sacrifice her individual development for the sake of the other child's ongoing support and care. The process of rebuilding my sense of self and my understanding of what I want from life has been both exciting and terrifying, because it requires me to explore parts of myself that had been suppressed or ignored for so many years that I am not sure who I am when I am not primarily defined by my role as someone's caretaker and support system. Living with my grandfather has given me the space and the emotional safety to begin discovering what interests me and what goals I want to pursue, and what kinds of relationships I want to have with people who see me as more than just a helpful family member who can be counted on to put everyone else's needs before her own. The support I have received from my extended family has been both healing and eye-opening, because it has shown me what healthy family relationships can look like when they are based on mutual respect and genuine concern for everyone's well-being, rather than on one person's willingness to sacrifice their own development for the sake of others' comfort and stability. My aunts and uncles have made it clear that they see value in my education and my future plans and my right to make choices based on my own interests and aspirations, rather than on inherited obligations that were never fairly distributed among all the family members who might have shared responsibility for Emma's care and support. The decision to attend college in a different state represents more than just an educational choice, but also a commitment to discovering who I am supposed to become when I am not constantly managing crisis situations and accommodating other people's emotional needs, and maintaining family stability through my own ongoing sacrifices and adjustments. The scholarship opportunities and academic programs that I am exploring all feel like invitations to explore parts of myself that had been dormant or undeveloped, because so much of my energy and attention had been directed toward managing family dynamics rather than pursuing my own growth and development. The conversations I have had with my grandfather about my future have been the first discussions about my life where the focus has been entirely on what I want to achieve and what kinds of experiences I am hoping to have, rather than on how my choices will impact everyone else's comfort and stability. The freedom to think about my own goals without constantly considering how they will affect Emma's care or my parents' stress levels or the family's overall functioning has been both exhilarating and overwhelming, because it requires me to access parts of my identity that had been suppressed for so long that they feel almost foreign and unfamiliar. The guilt that still surfaces occasionally when I think about Emma and wonder how she is managing without my constant presence and support is something I am learning to recognize as a natural part of the healing process, rather than as evidence that I have made a mistake in choosing to prioritize my own well-being and development. The family system that had trained me to believe that my value was tied to my usefulness and my willingness to sacrifice my own needs had also trained me to feel guilty whenever I made choices that prioritized my own growth and happiness over everyone else's immediate comfort and stability. The therapy sessions that I started after moving in with my grandfather have helped me understand that the anger and resentment I had been carrying toward Emma were actually displaced feelings about a family system that had failed to protect my right to have a childhood and adolescence that were not entirely defined by someone else's ongoing needs and challenges. Learning to separate my legitimate feelings about unfair treatment from any blame or resentment directed at Emma herself has been one of the most important parts of beginning to heal from years of feeling invisible and unimportant and valued, primarily for what I could provide rather than for who I was as an individual. The process of establishing boundaries with my parents has been difficult because it requires me to maintain my commitment to my own well-being and development even when they continue to express disappointment and frustration about my unwillingness to return to a family dynamic that was unsustainable and unhealthy for me. The phone calls and messages that continue to focus on when I plan to come home and resume my previous role, rather than on understanding why I needed to leave in the first place, confirm that they are still not willing to acknowledge that their approach to managing our family had negative consequences that deserved attention and adjustment. The support system that I am building through therapy and through relationships with extended family members and through new friendships that are based on mutual interest rather than on shared family obligations has shown me what healthy relationships can look like when they are not organized around one person's willingness to sacrifice their own needs for everyone else's benefit. These new relationships have helped me understand that caring about someone does not require you to disappear into a supportive role that offers no space for your own growth and development and individual identity. The college applications that I am completing all represent different versions of the future I am hoping to create, where I can pursue my interests in psychology and education, while also maintaining a healthy relationship with my family that does not require me to sacrifice my own aspirations and well-being. The possibility of studying child development and family therapy feels like a way to transform my experiences into something that might be helpful to other families who are struggling to balance the needs of children with special requirements while also protecting the development and well-being of their other children. The scholarship essays that I've been writing have given me an opportunity to reflect on how my experiences as Emma's sister have shaped my understanding of family dynamics and my commitment to advocating for children whose needs might be overlooked in families that are organized around crisis management rather than balanced attention to everyone's development and well-being. While I would not choose to repeat the difficult parts of my childhood and adolescence, I am beginning to see how those experiences might inform a career dedicated to helping families find healthier ways to support all of their members, rather than requiring some children to sacrifice their individual development for the sake of others. The relationship with Emma that I am hoping to rebuild once I have had time and space to develop my own identity and heal from years of carrying inappropriate responsibility for her care and well-being will hopefully be based on genuine love and concern, rather than on obligation and resentment that had accumulated over years of feeling invisible and undervalued in my own family. The distance that I have needed to create in order to prioritize my own development does not represent a permanent rejection of my sister, but rather a necessary step toward becoming capable of loving her in a healthier way that does not require me to disappear into a caretaker role that offers no space for my own growth and aspirations. The future that I am planning includes the possibility of maintaining a relationship with my parents if they become willing to acknowledge that their approach to managing our family had consequences that deserve attention and adjustment. But it also includes the acceptance that they may never be willing to have that conversation or to make the changes that would be necessary for us to have a healthier relationship going forward. The decision to prioritize my own well-being and development, even when it disappoints people who had different expectations for how I should use my life, represents the first time I have chosen my own future over inherited obligations that were never fairly or appropriately distributed. The healing process that I am engaging in through therapy and through building new relationships and through exploring my own interests and goals has helped me understand that the anger and resentment I carried for so many years were actually appropriate responses to an inappropriate situation rather than character flaws or evidence of insufficient love for my family. Learning to trust my own perceptions and my own feelings about what I need in order to thrive has been one of the most important parts of beginning to recover from years of being trained to prioritize everyone else's needs and comfort over my own legitimate requirements for growth and development and individual recognition. The story that I am sharing with you today is not just about one family's struggle to manage the challenges of raising a child with special needs, but also about the importance of protecting every child's right to have their own identity and their own future, rather than being required to sacrifice their individual development for the sake of family stability. The lessons that I have learned about boundaries and self-advocacy and the difference between healthy love and self-sacrificing obligation are ones that I hope might be helpful to other young women who are struggling to balance their care for family members with their own legitimate needs for growth and recognition and individual development. If you are listening to this story and recognizing parts of your own experience in what I have shared, please know that choosing to prioritize your own well-being and development does not make you selfish or ungrateful, but rather makes you wise enough to understand that you cannot take care of others effectively if you have never learned to take care of yourself. The guilt and the pressure and the expectations that others might place on you do not define your worth or determine your obligations, and you have the right to create a life that allows you to flourish as an individual while also maintaining healthy relationships with the people you love. The path forward from family dynamics that require some members to sacrifice their individual development for others' benefit is not always easy or straightforward. But it is possible and it is worth pursuing, even when it requires difficult conversations and temporary distance, and the courage to disappoint people who have different expectations for how you should use your life and your energy and your talents. The support and understanding that you need in order to heal and grow might come from unexpected sources, and the family that you create through choosing healthy relationships might become just as important as the family you were born into. Even if those relationships require different boundaries and different expectations than what you experienced growing up, your story matters and your feelings are valid and your dreams deserve to be pursued with the same enthusiasm and support that would be offered to anyone else in your family. And if you are not receiving that support from the people who should be providing it, then you have the right to seek it elsewhere, and to create the conditions that will allow you to discover who you are meant to become when you are not constantly managing everyone else's emotional and practical needs. The future is waiting for you to claim it, and you deserve to approach that future with excitement and confidence, rather than with guilt about prioritizing your own growth and well-being over inherited obligations that were never fairly or appropriately assigned.